I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Hey, what's up, world? Good morning. Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like Live. I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. Please make sure you are really subscribed everywhere. So now, obviously, after the launch, and if you missed it, please check back with the channel, the new Black Power Media channel. Or the revamped I Mix What I Like, now Black Power Media channel, and see all that the collective is doing. You can rewatch the launch or watch for the first time the launch that we had the other day to commemorate Dr. Huey P. Newton's birthday on the 17th. And everybody, well, not technically not everybody, but so many of us were there that evening. Rosa Clemente, the Renegade Culture crew, Kamau and Kalanji, and the Ear Doctor were there. Dr. Sundiata Chajua was there. Of course, airing tonight in episode 3 at 7 p.m. Eastern. Dr. Sharice Burden-Stelly was there in the Last Dope Intellectual show, again, airing episode 3 tonight. Where she actually is very interesting. She talks about a little bit about her very different perspective, I'll say, on Judas's and movies, and a little bit of Du Bois, a little African Roots of War, a little writing workshop. So it's a great show. 7 o'clock Eastern tonight is when it will premiere. Anyway, all of these folks were there. Lukamon Nation was there, and they've just I think later today they're going to be live, I think 5 p.m. Eastern on this channel. Lukamon Nation is now with us as well. I feel like doing that old BDP, Lukamon Nation is down with us. Dr. CBS is down with us. Making funky black radical music media is a must. We're number one. It's like, all right. Anyway, a lot going on. So please check all that out and make sure you've joined the channel. Again, you see we're already expanding. We already announced that the morning show is going to start next month. We already announced that in a sort of surprise at the launch, that the artist and activist No Name, she is going to join the channel with a monthly show. I mean, there's just a lot coming already. So the more you can support, click that join button, click those like buttons, all of those things, get more people to interact and make this part of their media rotation, their media diet, the better. And yeah, before we get, look, I think Ben Dixon and his crew do some important work. They have a new morning show, and yes, Ben invited me on the other day. And it's not on him to plug Black Power Media. That's on me, and I didn't do it. That's just my own mistake. I don't, trying to focus on too many other things, and sometimes I just don't catch everything. But yeah. Anyway. Yeah, so anyway, it was cool. It was a good discussion, and we all don't have to be on the same page. Although he assures me we're more likely to be on the same page than I realize. So it's all good. I just like that we have all these options. So anyway, a lot more to come, and we'll come back and engage the comments and chats in just a minute. But I do want to turn to our next guest because there is a lot, of course, going on. Oh, by the way, sorry about that. Later today, please come back at 2 p.m. Eastern for Yusuf Bunshi Shakur, who's going to join us, longtime activist, organizer, formerly incarcerated, to talk with us about the reality beyond films or film depictions of organizing street organizations, politicizing them. So please come back and join us for that as well later today. But right now, speaking of beyond the headlines, there's a lot being said, and I'm in fact borrowing that title from a set of presentations and discussions our next guest put me onto in preparation for today, as much as I could prepare for today. This idea of moving beyond the headlines, that is for those of us who teach, for those of us who work with others in any form of capacity, or those of us who just sort of pay attention to how these things go. Once you look behind the headlines of almost any story, and in fact, in my own classrooms, we often start with, just as a self-assessment, how much have you read or studied or spent time investigating the histories and details involved with any headline you're presented with? And it's a good just exercise. I use it all the time. It's a good humbling, reference point to start from, or point of departure. And once you get beyond the headlines, you start to realize, obviously, that so much is not being said and not being offered. And particularly if you've studied a particular topic and see it presented in commercial media, it is often wildly misrepresented. So to try to get beyond that, we wanted to talk about beyond the headlines in what's going on in Haiti with our next guest, who is, among many other things, a visiting professor of Africana Studies at Davidson College, an international coordinator for community movement builders, an organization Kamal Franklin is a member of, with Renegade Culture and Black Power Media, an organization I'm a member of as well. So we want to bring her up now to talk about her work in around this issue in the history of Haiti, and that is, of course, Dr. Mamyrah Prosper. Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to the program. It's good to see you again.
I just wanted to first say congratulations on Black Power Media.
Thank you.
Yes.
Right on. Thank you very much. No, it's very exciting. We're looking forward to it. So thank you very much for that. And it reminds me, the last time you and I spoke was with Bunchy Carter, was with Yusuf Bunchy Shakur, I should say. I keep calling him Bunchy Carter. Yusuf Bunchy Shakur. So it's funny that timed out today as well, with him joining us later today.
We were talking about the defund the police statement.
Defund the police statements, all of that stuff. Speaking of getting behind the headlines.
To this positioning, to some of the ways we might think and talk about Haiti today. I hope we can get it.
No, absolutely. So if you would just catch us up with what is going on now, and then we'll obviously start to try to get into some of the context and the history behind it and the reasons why we're here today. But what is happening in Haiti right now that we need to be aware of, again, beyond the headlines?
Right. So, essentially there's sort of the theatrics, the political theatrics that make the headlines when, essentially we know that there is an opposition force. So the folks who were part of political parties, who at some point were members of parliament, who always, sort of position themselves from the beginning of this party that's in power, against them and their particular project. And so that tends to be how we see the headlines, The opposition is fighting, the party in power, and we forget about the people on the ground, The actual folks who come and bring their bodies to the protests, and who always are facing police repression, And so we're talking about folks, being shot in the head, so executed, right on the spot. We're talking about people being tear gassed. And some of these protests, and what we don't see, in the headlines, we usually see the protests where folks are burning tires, which I know to an American public is like, what is that all about, But the burning tires is obviously, a call to war, that, we're burning something up. That means that, we are saying that this is a battle. But these folks are not armed, Like the best arms they have are rocks. So you'll see the images of somebody throwing rocks. It makes you think of like a Palestinian, throwing a rock at the Israeli forces. And this is what people call violent protests, But actually the violence is coming from the police, in terms of the repression, in terms of shooting people, And then so we can't, and this is where the link with the US comes in. And much of the funding that the Haitian state gets for their security apparatus is coming out of funding from the State Department, In the State Department, or the US government has a series of initiatives that is guided, towards the Caribbean and providing security in the region against the war on drugs and the war on terror. So we see how, essentially different parts of the third world are serving as, and I'm putting Black Americans living in the US within my third world frame, right? But the fact that the US as an empire, right, is perfecting its technologies on varying peoples of African descent, right, and using these same technologies, right, on us in different places. I think that's something that we have to think through, right? And this sort of Black internationalist wave that we're trying to build right now, or that I'm trying to build, right? But that we're all part of. And just thinking about that thread, right? And so that's one of the, and of course, like the complication that, right, the Haitian police are Black people themselves, right? But thinking about their training, right? Many of Caribbean and Latin American armies today are being trained by, for example, Israeli defense forces, right? That are joined with the United States. Let's think about the perspective that they're bringing, right? Who are they constructing as the enemy? Who are they constructing as, right, the threat? It's the actual people within those countries, right? Because if you think about it, and this is part of like what I hope to share with you all here, is that Haiti's been under occupation, right, under the control of the US formally since 1915, right? And the armies, the indigenous armies, they called them, that Haiti had, essentially were undone, right? Disarmed, and essentially the US, right, trained these armies, right, within the logic of, right, Jim Crow South. Because the Marines who were in Haiti were US white Marines who had been trained, right, in the US South. So you see, again, the continuities, right, between the realities of, right, Black Americans and Black Haitians, right, as far as how they're being treated by the United States, you know, and I hope to be able to like make those connections clearer for us, right, around the military-industrial complex and, you know, the police, right, and that relationship and the way that we're thinking about it here is definitely, you know, part of what Haitians are experiencing in Haiti, to the point where even some of the protests, and again, that doesn't make it to the headline, some of the protests have been led by school children, and the police still send tear gas toward, you know, at these children. And there are images circulating that I can't even get myself to share of, right, you know, young children. There was a picture of a young girl who had passed out and died from ingesting tear gas, right? And so, you know, those are the things you're not hearing about, right? So we're talking about children. They don't have no guns, right? They're children, right? Coming in mass in the streets. And this is the police reaction to them. And why are people in the streets, right? And I feel like you had a question, Jared. I'm going to let you.
No, I mean, there's a lot, and I want to help you draw some of those connections too, because I mean, one of the first ones that comes to mind, just it's not really, it's more rhetorical, but is you know, why would children be out riotous in the streets? Children who are just naturally predisposed to happiness in almost any situation. Something horrific must be going on to get them even to the point. You know, beyond, you know, anyway, but just quickly, I did want to ask, when you said trained in the American South, was that now, I think I know it's been renamed, but the formerly School of the Americas, is that the same project? Okay, that's training all these militaries.
The U.S. Marine during the U.S. occupation of Haiti, which also, right, brought Jim Crow officially, legally to Haiti, right, which we don't tend to talk about enough, which, you know, exacerbated already some of our color-based class issues, right? But that the U.S. brought its entire machine, right, in logic to the Caribbean, because they were also occupying the Dominican Republic, Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, right? And every time they came to those places, they brought that U.S. Jim Crow logic, right, to the space, which included also training these armies, right? And training these armies to see, right, Black bodies primarily as, right, the subject of your, you know, policing. So I think that's important to note. But in terms of the children protesting, right, and this is how you see, you know, and the children protesting and school children protesting, like that's not new, right, in terms of the components to the struggle against this current party in power. But what it shows us, right, the children were reacting to a recent kidnapping of a young school child, right? And these kids that come to the street to say, we are vulnerable, right, to these armed, you know, we're calling them gangs. I think it's more correct to call them paramilitaries, right? That these paramilitary folks, and it's complicated too, right? Because we're talking about young people who join these gangs because there aren't many options, right, for them to reproduce themselves in the space, right? So that's, something that we can't take lightly. And of course, the gangs are, I'm not going to take away agency from people who made the choice to join them, right? But, that there are not that many options. And certainly people who are making less than $2 a day or completely broke, didn't come up with the money themselves to buy these guns, right? And Haiti's certainly not producing them. So what's behind that as well, right?
So many similarities, by the way. Yeah.
Yes. Right, that you're flooding these neighborhoods, right, through the drug trade, right, with guns, and then the people are turning the guns, right, towards, usually the gangs, right, they take care, if you will, of the people in their neighborhood, and taking care of. It's complicated because it also includes, right, often, thinking that, the women in your communities, their bodies belong to you, right, as a gang leader. So clearly taking care of, with a little asterisk, right, but turning the guns towards rival gangs from other poor neighborhoods, right? Not turning the guns to the obvious culprits, right? The folks who are wearing the suits and the ties, right, who are stealing billions of dollars, right, preventing the creation of opportunities for these same people who have to join gangs, right? What if you, instead of giving them guns, you actually funded public education, right? What if you actually built housing? What if you actually provided healthcare? Which is part
But
of.
see, this is what, and I don't mean to cut you off, and I want to come back to this because this is sort of the part where I want us to quickly. I'm almost rushing to get to the history because it is understood that whenever even a modicum of what you are describing is offered a group of people, particularly a group with the Haitian history, the fears in the West have to go through the roof. I mean, there are fears of what happens when Haitians start to have a little room to breathe and realize what their situation is, and maybe learn about who they are. We're already clear historically what happens, and that's why I think the West works so hard to prevent this. So before we even get to that, one of the questions I wanted you to say a little bit more about is that when you say, for instance, the U.S. has been in control since 1915. You've already sort of described it, even in terms of the logic that's imposed, but what does control mean almost on a day-to-day basis? I think myself included, sometimes it's hard to understand beyond the language or the hearing. What does it mean to have the U.S. control Haiti since 1915?
So one of the things that they put in place, right, when they came in 1915 is controlling, right, customs. So ensuring that they were the ones collecting, right, any kind of income coming through the country from Haiti, right, exporting, for example, right? And they did this in more than just Haiti. But you also have during the U.S. occupation, there's a text by historian Peter Hudson that's how, you'll remember this one, How Wall Street Colonized the Caribbean. You can't forget that title, right? And it's all about this moment, right? And many authors historians looking at that time say, right, the U.S. is coming into, certainly because of its imperialist desires, right? But it's driven by specific capitalist interests, specifically the banks, right? Who figured out the scheme essentially that we are, the logic of the day is development. And places like Haiti can't quite develop, right, quote unquote, the way that we see development in the United States. So, I have a solution. I'm going to lend you the money for you to develop so you can buy all the shit I make in my country. There are signs of development, right? Material wealth and comforts, right? We're talking about.
So those loans can't be used for whatever the Haitian people want, or to buy whatever the Haitian people want, or from whomever the Haitian people want. They can only buy from, I'm giving you money to give back to me.
Pretty much, right? And the same logic carries through when you're looking at, right, the IMF, the World Bank, by the time we're getting to the, end of the 20th century. And that's true not just for Haiti, right? That these supranational institutions, right, who are housed in Washington, so it's clear, right, who runs them, are going to all have a seat at the table of almost every, right, previously colonized state, right? So today in Haiti, the president is more accountable to the World Bank, to the IMF, right, to the U.S. embassy than he is to the people on the ground. So one of the things to note about that, right, how the U.S. comes to have control over this space is that there is the complicity, the participation of an elite group of Haitians who are like, that looks good to me, right? Because I'm likely to make money out of some of these deals. And this is what we see happening, right, during this time of terror and repression against the Haitian people who are demanding better life conditions. The state is like, I'm going to repress you, and meanwhile, I'm going to be basically selling Haiti to the, lowest bidder, really, right? Because I can just dispose Haitians from their lands, because, they don't count at people, Haitian lives don't matter. A lot of people are starting to use the Black Lives Matter sort of slogan to make the connections, to say, right, if y'all in the United States are complaining, right, about the white supremacists and nationalists, like, playing target practice with you, certainly, right, Haiti still, is also being subjugated in these ways that we don't find problematic because, right, more Black people dead on this planet doesn't really bother, right, the mainstream, right? And so this is why we're, when there's not as much scandal, right, about what's happening in Haiti, particularly because it is considered a Black state, right? Well, these are Black people doing it to each other, right? But basically, as there's the repression, the state is selling out pieces of land, right, that people were living on. There's not like really that much empty land like that. Specifically, we're talking about flatlands that are technically places where you can actually grow food. Right? They're like, grow food? Why do we need that, right? If you're thinking about the Clinton logic when he came to Haiti in the 90s, as he's signing off, right, this farming bill that is going to give industrial farmers in Arkansas all kinds of opportunities, right, to make money, he's then saying to the Haitian people, don't worry about producing food, just worry about development, right? And really contributes to crashing the national production of Haiti, that Haiti imports over 50% of its food, and from the United States, right? And then
50% of its food
it's like
from the United States.
From the United States primarily. Some of it's coming from the Dominican Republic, but through agreements that the U.S. controls, right? And the U.S. has a series of initiatives, right, country-based and also region-wide, to control what's happening in the Caribbean. And it was particularly important for the U.S. to do that because Venezuela was saying to the Caribbean, look, we can do our own thing. We don't always have to have Canada and the U.S. up in our business because we already know what they do. Let's try something different. And this is where the Petro Caribe stuff came out. Venezuela had this program, and essentially it was, better rates. I'm going to give you the petroleum products. You can pay me later. Take the money and do social programming, public housing, health care.
But Dr. Prosper, all we hear about Venezuela up here is they have to be overthrown, and this is the socialist menace. And what they're doing is not helping their own people, much less Haitians. And excuse me, their own elected officials aren't even real, because even the current Haitian elected leader supports Juan Guaido, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, yes. So like so what's going on here, Dr. Prosper? It sounds like you're talking
the elected leader, right? I've been trying to do this thing where I'm, using some of the concepts in the U.S. about the Black misleadership, right, to think about Haiti and the folks who lead us, right, who are supposedly elected. And we could talk about, how democracy gets boiled down to like electoral politics, right? But millions of people on the street who are saying what they want, that's not democracy. Like, y'all need to sit and wait for elections, right? Like, the people have spoken, right? We don't need a ballot box to say what it is that they have clearly said. And they already know every time they vote, right? I'm not 100% going to say Aristide, right, is like, would have led us to this freedom. But what I can recognize and appreciate is that he was the one people chose. Right? And people went to, and they did the dance. They were like, okay, you say democracy's election, I'm going to vote. And when they did vote, overwhelmingly for him, he wasn't in power for more than 8 months, right? And the US was like, we can't. And in the case of Haiti, this particular president in power, from the minute that he was actually supposedly elected, the Haitians took to the street, they said there was fraud. 40% of the votes that this man received back in 2015 was cast by zombies. They called them the zombie votes, right? So they went and found a bunch of dead people's, electoral cards, and then they voted, right? So people already had said, you're not legitimate. because he was also going to continue more of the same that the previous mandate, the previous term of that president had led to nothing, no development in Haiti, and stealing 2/3 of this Petro-Caribe money, and not one fucking hospital, not one hospital, right? Not one finished bridge. Like I was driving down, I kept saying, what is this? Is it supposed to be an art? It was supposed to be a bridge that never got finished. So people are seeing like how the money was misused. 25 soccer stadiums, and some of them are like little parks where you might like, put a couple goats in it, and you call that a stadium, and millions of dollars just went through that. 25 Haitians don't need 25 soccer stadiums. They need hospitals. They need housing. They need.
Yeah, I was gonna say I didn't know like the leagues were that dominant down there. I mean,
right? It's a small country. There's 12 million people. We don't need 25 soccer fields, right? But this current president already, for 1 year, people protested him to the point where an interim government had to take over. This is how much people were like, no, from the beginning. And he still was able to be inaugurated. And he has been protested daily with multiple shutdowns since the beginning. The ask that folks are making now, right, or in leveraging arguments about the Constitution, that's just them trying to find more ways, right, within the logic of democracy, to be able to say what they've been saying the entire time this guy's been in power. We don't want him, and we don't want his party, right, because they're selling the country and they're killing us, right? And the way that they're doing the killing is particularly via these paramilitary gangs, right, where the state can say, I had nothing to do with it. But the same president who's ruling completely alone by decree, because he disbanded parliament, so he controls the justice system, right? He says, I have nothing to do with the gangs. But you just said, after God, there's no one greater than you in the space, and you're supposed to control the border. Yes? He said, there is no more important being in the country except for him after God, right? And he's wielding a Black nationalist discourse, much like Duvalier, talking about how we, the people, have been suppressed, and the oligarchy this, and then literally a week later, he's signing some decree giving this oligarchy more land of the people, in this case recently, to produce for Coca-Cola. This just happened last week, right? We're hearing about all these protests, and you're thinking this guy's on his way out. And he's signing, law decrees giving, I think it's an outrageous number of like acres of land to this oligarch, the people he claims, right, or have taken over the country against us, the Black nationalists, right? Land to further, right, capitalist projects for Coca-Cola, not for the Haitian people, right? And he's using that to, basically hide the truth of what he's doing, which is that he's interested in his own Black empowerment, his personal Black empowerment, right? Not everybody else's.
So before we, at least one more question on this before, well, at least there are many others, but I wanted to sort of stay on this point just briefly, because I know for me at least, selfishly, I know one of the goals here is to draw some of these connections to problems in the diaspora. One of the problems I've been focused on a lot in the United States for Black people here is this question of Black capitalism and Black entrepreneurialism as a solution to all the inequality and suffering. What I hear you describing is very much an important issue to me, that it is the control over public policy and political power that is creating all of this, even when it's occurring hundreds and miles away in terms of policy being created here in DC for Haitian people. In other words, the solution, from your perspective, if I'm hearing you correctly, the solution for Haitian people is not the establishment of small businesses and an entrepreneurial spirit and circulating the dollar within the community. I hear that the problems facing the Haitian people and that are being imposed on the Haitian people are beyond something about Haitians not having a sufficient financial literacy or entrepreneurial spirit of some kind. In other words, there is something broader I'm hearing, correct me if I'm wrong, in terms of the apparatus that is creating all of this, that's resulting in people in the streets. And again, the people in the streets are not being told from those who care about their condition to simply go back and start a small business and circulate the dollar in their community?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think that a couple of things about Haiti, at least, in terms of the ideals of the revolution and some of the ways that those ideals are still, embodied by some people, right? That their entire existence is not wrapped around, right, wanting to make more profit, right? And wanting to, and I'm not saying that people don't want better living conditions, right? But there's a sort of way of life that they're interested in protecting, right? That these development projects threaten, right? Which is why we see the clash. And also, I think we think of Haiti and we're like, oh, there's not enough capitalism. There is a lot of capitalism, right? Actually, the entire place is like, really unbridled, savage capitalism that takes place with no labor regulations, right? No real respect for minimum wage or working conditions, right? And maybe, I think the Haitians, what they call the informal economy, folks are already doing some of this, like circulating the money within the community thing, right? But people are also doing, right, other sort of, mutual aid type of actions with each other, right? Which are not monetarized, right? One of the things that's important for people is that, like, not every relationship I have with a human being should also, should be about money and transaction, right? They're also, attempting to protect those kinds of relations between people, right? But there is especially, coming out of the middle class, folks like me, who lived in Haiti, the States, coming back with this entrepreneurship thing that they're going to do, but finding, much like we see here, right? Like, well, the people who do well as entrepreneurs also, had a lot of startup capital that came with some other privileges that they already had, right? So the Haitians are, some of them and the people that I'm closest to are interested in more like the cooperative building, right? How do we put together to create, right, some of these solidarity economies that, are for us much more thinking about the community as a whole than an individual, right? Becoming rich. So there are these alternative ways that folks are trying to and have been able to survive the space. Like, if it wasn't for these mutual aid, relationships, I think people would be far worse. But it is also these mutual aid relationships that bring people to the, together to protest, right? So I don't know that I have a clear answer for.
No, that was.
Right? But I feel like the grassroots people have a better answer than even the political opposition in Haiti right now, right?
Right on.
Who are still very much locked into, right, the U.S.-based development model. They're like, yeah, I want power, but I'm like, power so that you can get to sit with the U.S. embassy and have them tell you what to do as opposed to this other guy, right? So when are we going to actually move away from this model of development, like, and not think that Haiti's going to be Miami? Right. If you know anything about Miami, I used to live there. Like, it's about to be underwater, and people, have been calling for a moratorium on building, but yet they keep building, right, as the seawater rises. So even thinking about, like, do we want this development that we see in the north that a lot of people are starting to realize, right, are having all kinds of effect on, the weather? It's freezing in Texas right now, right, and that's a consequence of, some of our, overdeveloped societies. Wanting more and more and more, right, to consume. And another point, about thinking about capitalism and thinking about Haiti, right, the factories in Haiti, right, we're talking about Coca-Cola, right, we're talking about factories making Walmart clothes, Target, Zara, right? So actually, one of the best things we can do to be in solidarity with ourselves, with Haiti and other third world, is to start rethinking how we consume, right? And why we think we need to have all this shit in our house, right? And I just think that those are the questions on this end that we need to ask, right? When we see what's happening to the rest of the world, and particularly to Black people in other parts of the world, who are paying the price for our development.
No, I mean, but yeah, I absolutely, all of that. I appreciate all of that. Part of the point for me would be, and I think even the way we framed our discussion this morning is that the same model or system of propaganda or psychological warfare that's being waged on our understanding of what's happening in Haiti is being waged to encourage us to see ourselves as being better and happier with more consumption. So, I mean, and it's a very sophisticated, I learn more about it every day, try to at least. And it's a very, I mean, I hate it, but I appreciate how they do it. I mean, it's to me, it's impressive how much effort and work is put in to managing us in that way. And it's largely successful. So that's, one of the concerns we're trying to address, obviously, with this collective, this Black Power Media Collective, and in highlighting the work that you and others are doing. By the way, I am still trying to learn how all these algorithms and things work. And one of the things that I have learned, folks, is that if everybody who actually does feel this way, who is watching, clicks the like button, it helps these videos show up in the algorithm and all of that. So I noticed that not everybody watching has hit like. So if you would at least do that, it does help. And then if you would consider subscribing and joining the channel, you're supporting a growing network. You're not helping someone become another YouTube individual or whatever. So, I hope that helps people, feel better about the process. That's not the goal here. I do want, feel free to do, obviously, to address this any way you'd like, but I would like to come more aggressively to this question of the importance of the internationalist piece that you were talking about and building this I forgot the exact phrase you used, but this Pan-African Black international movement. And I just wrote a note here. I always like to ask, particularly when I think about my own students, why should the diaspora care about Haiti? I mean, I know why I do. I know why certain traditions of radicals and do, but why should a Black American, for instance, care about what's happening in Haiti? Someone, particularly as you mentioned, struggling with their own immediate conditions, who might think it hard to look beyond even their own neighborhood, much less the country. Or why should someone on the continent or somewhere else in the Caribbean care? How does that work, and why do you think it's important?
Well, I mean, in a very selfish way, right? Or self-interested way, as I said earlier. Right, that Haiti serves, if we think about, Haiti as the first Black republic in the 1900s, right, during which it was certainly a threat, right, to all the empires that owned, right, Black people, right, as property. And so has always been sort of a foreshadowing of what's to come, right? For example, that in 1825, France would say to Haiti, you need to, repair the planters who've lost, right, property, aka people, right? And we already see that that's going to be a trend in the Caribbean and certainly in the U.S., right, where the people who were, damaged are not the ones who've been compensated for, right, loss of life and exploitation of labor, right? So you see many times, right, Haiti's already sort of a forewarning for what's to come, within like the white supremacist world that we live, right? Also thinking about the U.S. occupation, and those links, right, are very clear, right? We're talking about U.S. Marines, white Marines, Jim Crow coming to Haiti and, right, applying, right, some of their technologies of control, right, over the Haitians, and then whatever they've learned there, taking it out to other parts of the Caribbean and back to the U.S., right? So I think in terms of the military link, the police link, those worries are the same, right? Because the U.S. is essentially funding war all over this planet, right? And there are specific targets or specific places, laboratories where it's perfecting its tools, its technology. So in those ways, I was reading a book, I'm rereading the book by Clyde Woods, who's a geographer, called Development Arrested. And he's talking about the Mississippi Delta region and the instrumental role that Clinton, as a governor of Arkansas, played in the demise of African-American communities in that region. And I'm reading this book going, it's the same Clinton, right? And I mentioned this a little earlier, who when he's president is signing, right, these contracts that are having effects on African-American communities, right, in the US, but coming to also lead to the destruction of national production in a place like Haiti. He's taking rice produced in the Mississippi Delta by industrial farmers and dumping it on Haitian markets, right, because they need to sell, right, and they've gotten subsidies from the state. And I'm thinking, these two sides have been impacted by the same person, right, through some of the same companies, right? You have these big, lobby groups, American Rice, USA Rice, whatever it is, right? There are actually greater ways for us to think about if we were to look at the full production to consumption chain, we could come to see how, right, African Americans, Haitians, maybe some other, right, Black bodies are involved, in the process, if anything, being, right, dispossessed of land, right, and whatever development plans, right, don't really include the development of the people, right? And then in this case, right, we're talking about African Americans in the Mississippi Delta and then Haitians in the northeast of the country. And you're thinking, oh, like, and I kept looking at this book, like, the links are already made, right? Via the character of Clinton, right, who's a Democrat, they're supposed to be on our side and whatnot, right? So I think those are some of the other ways we can see the links, right? That would help maybe folks to see that there's a connection here, that there are certain bodies in the American region particularly who are more exploitable than others, right? And Haiti actually helps to keep the wages down, right? Haiti has the lowest minimum wage in the entire Americas, right? That's not on purpose, that would be the role that Haitians would come to play. Even during this US occupation in 1915, that was what was happening. Haitians were being encouraged in many ways to leave Haiti and to serve as a labor pool in Dominican Republic and Cuban sugar production, right? Because when the US looks at the region, it looks at the whole map. We're thinking, oh yeah, if you live in Alabama, you're Black, right? You're in a separate existence than the person in the Caribbean and Jamaica. The US is just looking at the whole map. It's looking at the whole thing and figuring out, okay, well, we'll put this industry here, we'll get the labor from here, and then we'll take the land from these people here, right? We'll get the money from here, right? That they're really looking at the whole thing as a map and taking different pieces of, right, the process. I'm being taking different pieces of this process, right, from different parts of the map, right, where, and, for what our concern is, right, people of, African descent, right, are living. Their land tends to be the land that's easy to take away, right? That's part of, like, what we see in all of our anti-gentrification movements. Who's likely to be displaced willy-nilly? Like, I don't have to give you an explanation. I can just move you from this, right? And I can use your land however I want. I can be in Flint and pollute your water, right? Because, like, we got to produce for consumption. And I don't care, right, that your family's going to be affected from their water sources, right? We can see over and over again that these are the same people disenfranchised over and over again, right? Historically, and, through our enemies are very Pan-African in their outlook. I'd love to know more what that means. But yes, I think this is how I see the connections, right?
No, I think if I can be presumptuous and speak for Brother Ellie there, I agree with the point that he's making, that to those who rule, to Western Empire, to white supremacists, to capital, they look at all of us in a very Pan-African way. They're not, to the point you're making, they're not looking at us as, well, they're Haitians and they're from Alabama. They're saying, oh no, we have purpose for all of you, and we will subjugate you accordingly. But that actually brings a point. We often, when we have these conversations, we often ask about the impact of the United States on these other populations in the relationship from that perspective of African people or Black people colonized here on those communities. To what extent do you think, because we know that the unfortunate reality is that a lot of people in the diaspora don't have the appropriate positive look at Black people here in the United States. And I'm wondering to what, and often part of the discord is that the mythology that suggests that Black people here should have done more with the opportunities. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering to what extent that all you describe happening as a result of U.S. policy in Haiti and elsewhere could be understood by people there, or to be used to help people understand better what Black people actually face here. In other words, this idea of opportunity doesn't exist. This idea that we have some sort of power, despite the projection of certain Obamas or Harris's or whoever else's, it may not be the case. Does that? I don't know.
No, I totally hear your question. I think the movements that we call Black Lives Matter, right? Like we sort of put it under that umbrella. And I want to recognize the myriad of organizations that existed before, this slogan, right? But I want that resonated to all kinds of different Black people on this planet, right, who are living or not, right, in white supremacist societies, right, including in Haiti. And there's a lot of, work coming out from sort of militant scholars, scholarly militants, right, about drawing the connections between what's happening in Haiti to what's happening in the States. Right, folks are saying, you see how they're treating their own Black people, right? And then you think that the U.S. is going to treat Haiti as a whole any differently, right? People are making those connections. We're seeing, right, and the deportation by Biden, right, who refused, by the way, to promise he was going to do anything on immigration for Haitians. He went there and did a dance in Miami, and they were like, so you're going to make sure we don't get deported? And he was like, I'll see what I can do, right?
Oh, I know. I thought it was going to be all good now that he got elected. I thought everything only problems emanated solely from Trump.
Right? 1,800 people are slated to be deported just this month, right? Haitian people, including babies, children, right? This is also, Biden can't then say, oh, well, there's dictatorship in Haiti and terrorism, right? Terrorism from the state itself. I'm going to send these people back to a place where everybody who's there is saying, hello, like we're being, right, terrorized here by our state. It doesn't fit, what the U.S. needs to portray of Haiti to be able to send these people back, right? But I think if Haitians didn't get it, I hope they're getting it now, right? That this division that's been manufactured, because there are many moments in Haitian and African American history where folks have done this work of translating and they got it. It was clearer to them in the early 20th century, right? When Jim Crow was there in the South, it's there still, de facto, right? But it's not in the books anymore, right? That maybe this is part of why folks have sort of forgotten these natural ties, right? But during those times, it was clear to folks in Panama, it was clear to folks in, the Dominican Republic, it was clear to folks in Haiti and African Americans in the South that there is something common about our experience within U.S. empire. But, since then, I think the U.S. does a very good job, and I'm very happy to see Black Power media and other alternative media, right? The U.S., media machine is huge, right? And it's like planetary. It dominates, right? And it has a certain way that it comes to portray, right, African Americans in the minds of others, right? Lifts up something like hip hop, where everybody's looking to hip hop as an answer, right, to their own specific, contextual oppressions, right? But also within those images and what's being carried out, it's one that's creating divisions, right? And not properly explaining, right, why are African Americans still predominantly poor, right? That it's not some culture of poverty, like innate thing about them. That's the same argument that's used to explain Haiti. It must be something innate about y'all that you still can't, 217 years later, right, launch. But Haitians will have all the explanations as to why we didn't launch, right? But the African Americans, it must be something about, right? Like, so I think the U.S. propaganda machine has created those divides and really pretended as if like nation state forms, right, are real while it organizes across borders, right? So it's our job to keep, right, or to keep showing to folks how these borders are invented to precisely prevent us from, right, collaborating and organizing towards, global white supremacist capitalism. I'm hoping that's the work I can do here, being that, I'm an in-between person, right? And would love to see, Black Power Media talk about doing some translation work, right? Doing stuff in Spanish, doing stuff in Creole. And
that is actually a question I have for you. And a number of folks in our circles have already raised this as an issue. And being married into a Spanish-speaking Panamanian family, I see already so many of the issues in my own limitations in life and whatever. But
you guys are doing great. I don't want to act like, I'm adding more to your plate, but I think that would be useful for us.
No, in fact, one of my questions for you, especially after the links you asked me to review in advance of today's discussion. I mean, it hit me, right in the face, because you all had a lot of French-speaking spokespeople and translation work going on, and that. We already are in touch with people who are in different countries and languages and getting them involved. And that's another reason why we are inviting people to be as supportive as we can get them, because all of this is difficult and takes, it is just more work. But one of the questions that I have for you is, because this is an issue, both as someone who's involved on some level in academia, but more importantly in trying to be involved in some sort of activist, global struggle. The limitations of being an Anglophone, singularly Anglophilic or whatever, speaking only English is a major problem. So I did have a question here for you. To what extent do you think that inhibits the work that needs to take place, this linguistic barrier that is equally the result of Western imperialism? But we in this country, maybe more than anywhere else, are singularly monolingual, I think, as a result of the particulars of oppression here, but and the relationship that this country is as an empire to the rest of the world, forcing others to speak English more than we're forced to learn other languages. But anyway, that particular issue, could you say more about it and how it inhibits or works and it plays in the work that you do?
I mean, I think it definitely inhibits it. So I see many more of my Haitian comrades are connected to Caribbean and Latin American networks. And part of that has to do with, where some of those activists were able to travel, study elsewhere, made networks. I came to the States, I've made networks, in the States, and particularly with Black Americans. And so I've been, on some, we need to translate to each other. And, I think at least in the beginning is being patient with the process of translation, I'm always in that in-between space. And I know sometimes I'm like, oh, it's a lot, right? But it's being patient with the time that you have to give to translation, not just in terms of language, but ideas and concepts and perspectives, right? Because even us, who are in the States organizing some communities, you're doing some translation work too, right? And so just thinking about it, within that, that's the work we do, is translate, right? At least, those of us who think of ourselves as organizers. And so, I'm thinking both the patience to give to that process, but I actually, while I was there last month, met a bunch of Central Americans who said, there's a total silence on Haiti. And we felt that we had to come and find out what's going on because, right, their history books aren't really talking about Haiti, right? The news isn't really giving them any real perspective. And so what they built was sort of a translation co-op. So they come to Haiti, they learn Creole, they teach Spanish to the Haitian grassroots folks, and then they go back to where they're from and then they teach them Creole. And the idea is that we can come to speak to each other directly in the languages that we operate. Now, that's a long commitment, right? And everybody can't do that. But that's one type of thing that could be done in addition to, right, like how you saw in the People's Forum event, there was like a dubbing, right? As the person spoke, someone else was translating. That's another thing that I think easily with this media form could be done. Maybe not every show, maybe there's a specific show that's thinking about translation and would, do all that work because it is a lot, it's heavy. But I hope that that's something that, along the way you guys would consider doing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we already have. I mean, it's already on the table. So it's a matter of figuring out how and who.
This is the moment, right? Other Black people on the planet, for sure, right? But Haitians are, right? They're like, y'all are in the belly of the beast. Give it to them, right? And that means they don't completely understand also the limitations that, Black radicals have in the state also. Right? There's this idea that, y'all are going to take this for us and then it's going to work. And I'm like, well, they're having trouble taking some of their own things, forward. I'm just saying that, again, to your point, how do people come to think of the United States not like, oh, it's a democracy that's fully working, right? And that whoever is not participating is choosing not to, right? And rather understanding material conditions here, right? So I do a lot of that when I'm on the Haiti side. I'm like, well, let me tell you what's really happening in the United States, right? As far as it relates to people that you're most likely to be in the category with, right? Just so you know, because people just have an impression of this place. And so when I was showing people pictures of protests in the States, they were like, what? This is happening over there? I was just like, yes, it wasn't really in the news. right? That all these people had taken to the streets and were protesting police violence, right? Like that wasn't, the dominant news in Haiti too wasn't wanting to report some of that, right? Because they know like what that can do, right? Oh, if the black people over here are popping off, we're gonna pop off, right? Everybody's gonna pop off. You don't want any of that, right? There's also some of that happening, on the Haitian side. We have the same issues with dominant media, which is why folks are doing all this alternatives as you are using YouTube, Facebook, all these other places to get the word out. But it's the translation issue that remains. And so I need many more of me. Right? I can't do it all. Like I need more people, in the betweens to do that work.
Yeah. Listen, we're coming up on an hour, and I want to be mindful of your time. And it sounds like somebody was already looking for you, so I don't want to. But if
for me.
Yeah, right, of course.
Doing something,
yeah. So, but there are questions in the comments and chats. I don't know if you want to address any of them, but I also want to make sure that if there's not anything. I can pull some of them up, but I wanted to also make sure that if there's anything you wanted to make sure you address that I didn't invite you to, that you have time to do that.
We had an earlier question about Haiti versus Venezuela, and that's one of the arguments that Haitians are using, right? Like Nicolas Maduro was voted in like 60% plus, right, with votes, and people wanted him in power, right? And through the Organization of American States, which the U.S. controls, this is an organization that was put together, I think, 1949, 48. But during the Cold War, when the U.S. is trying to make sure, it keeps all of us under its watch, and we don't go over to the Soviet Union, right? That essentially Haiti voted against Venezuela, and this is a historical relationship between Haiti and Venezuela. When the Haitians won independence, right, and had really relied on guerrilla tactics, they are the ones who Simon Bolivar, white mestizo, Latin American, came to learn from Haitians how to fight back the Spanish, right? Also slightly betrayed some of the promises, didn't quite free the slaves immediately, but we can get to that. And so there's, Chavez has always talked about this historical debt that Venezuela has for Haiti, which is why it forgave Haiti's debt after the earthquake, $395 million. They were like, okay, don't worry about paying us. Focus on rebuilding, right?
And talk a second about how he was received.
Yes.
You would.
When he did come, so this Petro-Caribe agreement, when he came to Haiti for the new Haitian president after some years of clear occupation, Haiti was still being occupied, but we were able to have elections. He signed this agreement, and Chavez did come to Haiti, and people flooded the airports, right? Haitian people are very clear about the importance of Cuba and Venezuela, right? Whatever critiques we have about them, in the U.S. as dictators, Haitians are like, I'll take some of that, right? I'll take some of that, right? And so there's a lot of respect for Castro and Chavez, right? For their continual resistance to U.S. empire, but that also even with all the things against them, embargoes, they've been able to build something. I'm not going to say that Chavez and Castro were perfect, right? But we have to get a chance to make some mistakes, right? Capitalism has had 500 plus years doing its thing, and every time we try to build something alternatively, they crush us, right? So we haven't had as much practice, so there are going to be imperfections, right? And I'm not forgiving, certain things that should have never happened, but just wanting to understand also what was available, right, to these folks who had to still stay in military form because they have to be ready to fight from some outside assault instead of spending more time nation building, which I still think, Cuba has been able to do. If you've ever been to Cuba and you've been to Haiti, you're gonna be like Cuban Revolution any day, right? So that's the perspective for sure, I'm also a leftist, so that's my perspective. But I think if we were trying to play this objective game, we would see, right, why the global South has this respect for Cuba and Venezuela. And so,
as they say, only the left is right anyway. So
I love it. And so, you see this contradiction. The U.S. is saying Nicolas Maduro is a dictator. There were election frauds, yada yada. Also voting against, right, the Constituent Assembly, but also saying, in Haiti, those elections were proper. This guy who's running the entire space all by himself is proper, right? That's democracy, right? Because Haiti is a tool, right, in the struggle. Haiti has the largest U.S. embassy in the region. I was like, what are you guys doing, right? They've come to surveil the region from Haiti. It's symbolic, but it's also strategic. Why this place that you would come, and from which, you're essentially battling Venezuela. And I think they love the fact that particular party just blew $2 billion, right? And didn't actually put Venezuela's money into work. Imagine if Venezuela's money had actually created housing and hospitals in Haiti. That would be it. Like, the US would have no arguments, because the whole global South would be, I'm next, please, right? So I just wanted to go back to that point about Venezuela, and it's not in any way, and I know, like, I have Venezuelan comrades here who get real mad, with the defense of Venezuela, because they're like, he's a dictator. And I'm like, but 20 million people who are able to be housed when they weren't before in Venezuela, I'll take it.
I mean, thank you. I mean, and anyway, one question that was asked more than once, and thank you for repeating the question, because sometimes I can't catch them all. I got to come back to it. Can Dr. Prosper address the migration trends of Haitians throughout Central and South America?
Yes, great question. Yeah. Love that you asked it. I'm going to put a plug in for myself. The North American Congress for Latin America, there's a special issue coming out on Haiti on the 23rd of February. We're also hoping to do like a launch, and it's really about answering these questions, like, what the fuck is going on, right? Why are Haitians walking from Brazil to the US-Mexico border, right? Crossing 11 countries by foot, or behind some truck, right? Having to deal with all kinds of like brokers on the way, women reporting being raped all along the way, right? So how did Haitians end up in Brazil, and how are they ending up in the US-Mexico border? And so one of the things that's coming out that Latin American leftists are starting to own, right, is saying that, right, in 2004, the Brazilian army and the Chile army, Brazilian army under Lula, I'll say it, right, who was considered like a progressive, right, essentially came to occupy Haiti. Right, 2004 marks the bicentennial of the Haitian Revolution. Aristide, again, right, some folks are protesting, led by certain key elite members. This is the same guy who now got the land for Coca-Cola. That same guy was at the head of the movement that ousted Aristide the second time in 2004, right? So again, right, this oligarchy that supposedly the president is like anti, right? This is the same guy. Anyway, Aped, I'll say his name out loud. And so, right, and when he's removed, you're going to have an interim government put in place, run by some Haitian American guy who had never been in Haiti for like 30 years, but they put him, the US, put him at the top of the country. The Brazilian troops actually started the occupation, I'll call it, with a friendly soccer match between the national soccer team of Brazil and the national soccer team of Haiti, because everybody loved Ronaldo. So they were like, yeah, this is not an occupation. Other Black people have come to help us with peace, right? And you have the core group established. The core group is led by the US Embassy, the French, the Canadians, the Spanish, the European Union, and Brazil, right? So you see Brazil's like, sort of sub-imperialist desires emerging in this moment when they can go, right, take care of the most important threat to the security of the region at the time in 2004.
And I'm sorry. It hurts me because I think you're saying that when Brazil's national team went, you're saying that was, you said Ronaldo. That's by the way, for those who don't know, the real Ronaldo, El Fenomeno.
Mm-hmm.
That hurts.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know if he fully understood what he was doing, but he certainly, the Brazilian national soccer team was used to legitimize and present this moment as, we're just here to help, right? And then you had a series of other Latin American countries, including Bolivia, that sent troops to Haiti, right? Supposedly to bring peace. And this is all going to be accelerated, right, after the earthquake. Now it's going to be people coming from Angola, Jordan, to supposedly, right, help Haiti out. And when you look at the number of millions of dollars that went into the UN military occupation, if that money was just given to Haiti towards this so-called development that we're after, we would see, right, something perhaps positive. Now, the UN occupation continues to exist in Haiti, fewer number of troops. And we've seen what, right? Right now, people in Haiti are asking for some kind of a trial of the MINUSTAH troop. That was the name of the UN mission led by Brazil, because what happens when military people, what happens when you send aid to a country that is a militarized aid? I mean, if you say you come in and help me, why do you have guns? I'm confused about like how the food you're distributing and the guns come together, right? So you're gonna have, all kinds of rapes done. Right now they're calling them the MINUSTAH babies, because these are all people who, after they did their raping of children, of women, right, left the country because they have diplomatic immunity. So their countries just pulled them out, including, right, the Sri Lankan troops that essentially gave Haiti cholera, right, including, I think it was the Bolivians who had been named in, a rape scandal, right? Like, none of these people had to face justice, and they just left. And right, and all these, this generation of babies without fathers, rapist fathers, right, are going to exist in the place, right? And so so we got cholera, we got rapes, we got, right, one of the things about the Brazilians, and coming back to the question, when the Brazilians led this effort, there's even documentation about the Brazilian army saying that the operations that they led in Cité Soleil, right, which is a neighborhood known for Aristide supporters, that they use those same tactics against Afro-Brazilians during the World Cup, right? If you remember World Cup and Olympics, when they were, destroying people's favelas, because they were like, that's not cute for the tourists to see. And the military folks said, oh, Haiti had been a practice for us to come use on Afro-Brazilians, right, in Brazil. This is why I keep coming back to these connections, right? Like, these connections are clear. And so what you saw is like Haitian migration started. Right now, with this connection with Brazil, Haitians started thinking of Brazil as a new place to go. And because they needed workers, right, low-paid workers on the stadium for the World Cup and the Olympics, they welcomed Haitians in a sense. So these Haitians, right, got all these, coyotes. I remember seeing like hundreds of young people, right, in front of the airport waiting. And many of them had to pay like $4,000 for their own passage to the Amazonian border with Brazil to get in. And so what the Brazilian government did was like put them to work. And when there was no more work, the Haitians couldn't stay anymore because they didn't have all the support, right? They're undocumented, many of them. And they said, well, my cousin is living in the States. Like, usually the States is where people think they're going to go, right, to like fully become rich. So they started turning back their attention to go to the US. And you see this wave particularly accentuating in 2016 during, right, the beginning of this particular president's term, right? Now you have Bolsonaro coming up, and he's like clearly not about them Haitians. He's like, they need to go, right? That's also a reality. There, the Lula folks were a little bit more open to the Haitians and did, they still put them to work at low wages, but there was a greater welcome. There wasn't a xenophobic response, as opposed to when Bolsonaro came to power. It was a complete rejection of all others, including the Haitians. And that led to them having to leave and start migrating through, and some people stayed in Venezuela, but we know what happened in Venezuela. So folks just took on that road. And you'll see at the US-Mexico border, you have Cameroonians, Bangladeshi, right? All kinds of people that you're like, how are they ending up at the US-Mexico border, right? And among them also Haitians, which when we heard about the caravans, right, it was just, we understood it as Latinx and whatever we think that is, right? And we sort of forgot that there were many others, including Haitians, to the point where last year, 44% of people detained were, Haitian. So even within the conversations about immigration, they don't talk about Black immigrants, right? And so Haiti's like, you're not a citizen, we don't talk about you. You're not Latinx, whatever that means. So we don't talk about you in immigration. The Haitians get lost, and they're the ones who are deported in even greater numbers because they're lost. No one's capturing them, right? The immigrant, I think the immigration folks are starting to do more work around thinking and including Haiti. But, I'm asking us, Black radicals, in our work, right, to include Haiti more. So that's the connection with Brazil, the occupation, why Haitians went to Brazil and then had to then migrate to the US-Mexican border, always, right, looking for jobs, always running away from, right, repression. And, you know, some folks are also running away from like the effects of global climate change, right, on their land and their ability to produce food, even for their own consumption. So there are a series of reasons that made Haitians go to Brazil and then leave and come to the US, only to be, you know, detained in these centers and be deported right back to Haiti. Wow. So imagine you've done all that, paid $4,000 to get to Brazil, and then you had to leave and walk all the way up, and then they put you in a prison, and then they sent you right back to hell. Well, you know, hell in quotation marks, the hell that you were trying to leave. So I hope that was clear with the
it was very clear. It's just unfortunately disturbingly clear is the problem. You know, again, Dr. Prosper, anyway, I don't have, my questions have been relatively exhausted. I want to, again, if there's anything else you want to leave us with, please do. And also know that whether it's this particular show or any of the others on our platform, we definitely want to continue to support this work. And
translations, I can, you know, make sure to bring folks from Haiti.
Let's do it. Hey, if we don't reach out to you soon enough, feel free to reach back out and say, listen, we, you know, whether it's this next report that's coming out or project, and bring the translators and we'll work it out. We'll you know, yeah, definitely. So absolutely. Yeah. So definitely want to support that and encourage that as well. So, Dr. Prosper, thank you very much for joining us this morning. I really appreciated the work, and look forward to many more conversations and to learn more, much more work.
I look forward to all the things that Black Power Media is going to do. You have a great crew. I'm very excited.
Right on. Yeah, absolutely. And it's growing. So, and you're going to help it now that, you know, especially. So thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely. We're going to, absolutely. All right, Dr. Prosper, take good care. We'll be catching up with you again soon. Take care. All right. All right, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Please do come back at 2 p.m. Eastern for our discussion with Yusuf Bunchi Shakur about the realities beyond movies or depictions of realities in movies involving organizing the streets, street organizations, radicalizing, organizing, and the work that he has been doing for a long time in Detroit. Author, formerly incarcerated political prisoner himself, or politicized prisoner. So we definitely look forward to that as well. And someone with whom we've done work right with Dr. Prosper the last time she was with us around defund the police and community movement builders work. So, and then at 5 p.m., Lukman Nation will be live right here at Black Power Media. So please definitely check that out as well. And then at 7 p.m. Eastern will be the launch or the premiere rather of episode 3 of The Last Dope Intellectual featuring Dr. Sharice Burnham-Stelly. So you don't want to miss that. So, and then there's so much more already being uploaded at the channel, already there, coming later. So please involve yourself, support, hit the like button on this, hit the join button, and support this growing project. So that said, thanks everybody for joining us this morning. We certainly appreciate it and look forward to those. And thanks to those who are seeing this in the replay. And as always, as Fred Hampton used to say to you, we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody, and catch you in the whirlwind like Garvey. And we'll see you next time here at I Mix What I Like Live. Oh, I messed up my own ending. Let's try that again. Peace, everybody, if you're willing to fight for it, like Fred Hampton used to say, and catch you in the whirlwind like Garvey. Next time here at I Mix What I Like Live in Black Power Media. Peace, everybody. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.